Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We're excited to have New York Times bestselling author and future of work leader Dan Schawbel join our panel today to talk about the latest talent challenges and how organizations can get ahead through the power of talent intelligence. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please put them in the chat located at the bottom of your screen. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can also place those in the chat and our team will help troubleshoot. With that, I'll pass it over to our host, Rebecca Warren.
Hey folks, welcome to our chat today. We are going to talk to some brilliant people about disruptions, talent intelligence, the future of work, skills-based hiring, AI, tech, organizational strategy, and maybe a few other things if we have time. I know that's a lot to get to, so we won't take too much time before we get started. So my name is Rebecca Warren. I have been in customer success here at Eightfold for the past 3 years. Prior to Eightfold, I was in talent acquisition and HR for 20-some years, leading teams in restaurant, retail, and CPG organizations. But enough about me. I want to get to this amazing panel. So I'm going to have you all introduce yourselves. Jason, I'll have you start off, then we'll go to Sanya, and then we'll go to Dan. Tell us who you are, what led you to this point in your career, and for fun, what 2 hours of the day are you most productive? All right, Jason, we're going to start with you.
Wow, okay. Well, thanks, Rebecca. So wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Jason Serrato. I'm the Vice President of Market Strategy for Eightfold. I've been with Eightfold for just over 2.5 years. I've been in the HR and TA space for just over 20, much like Rebecca. I like to say I'm a recruiter by trade. I love kind of the intersection of technology and people and kind of the art and science of it all. I've been an industry analyst. I've been an HR executive. And now working for an HR vendor covering technology, leading, this transformation of the HR function into the future of work. What's my 2 most productive hours of the day? I would probably say I'm a little bit of a morning person. So here we are in the morning. I've already been up and out and got half my list of the day done already. So definitely a morning person, also very much driven by music. So I have several playlists that get me up and running, but that's a little bit of the secret of my success. I like lists. I like to cross things off, driven by music, and definitely in the morning.
I love that. Okay, that's good to note for future meetings. All right, yeah. Let's flip it on over to Sanya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sanya Khan, and I am the Chief Economist here at Eightfold. I've been here for roughly 2 years, almost 2 years now. It's been fantastic. I'm kind of leading all of the research initiatives here at Eightfold, which are centered around the future of work, AI, skills, skills-based hiring, all really exciting stuff that we'll get to talk to you all today about. Before this, I was at the Bureau of Labor Statistics working as a labor economist for the past decade or so. It was really interesting because I was looking at how technology could help all of these different programs within the BLS. So in a way, I feel like that's helped me with what I'm doing now in terms of AI and generative AI and how the future of work is going to be changed, how our work lives and our work will be changed because of these new technologies. So that's been pretty interesting and kind of comes all full circle, really. 2 hours of the day that I'm most productive are probably morning as well. It's 10 o'clock here on the East Coast and I've had my cup of coffee, so I'm ready to chat with all of you guys. Dan, I'll pass it along to you.
Perfect.
I'm Dan Schawbel. I have been in this HR space for just over 15 years. I'm the managing partner of Workplace Intelligence. We are a research and thought leadership agency focused on all things work. So whether it's talent intelligence, people analytics, AI, flexible work and remote work, basically every topic, skills-based learning, sustainability, like those are some of the hottest topics of the past year. So we just focus on what's, top of mind for CEOs, HR leaders, employees, managers, across the world. So we've done, research in 26 plus countries. Have now led 73 research studies, interviewing close to 3.2 million people. So wow. I just love this space. I think it's very interesting, especially in a post-COVID world where everyone was kind of uplifted. There was a lot of disruptions, and now there's been a lot of experimentation. I think the biggest skill now is adaptability. There's actually recent articles written about it because, that's part of what we're going to talk about today, and I think it's so valuable in terms of when I work best. We're already kind of past that time. 8 to 10 in the morning is typically the sweet spot. The second sweet spot is 10 to noon, though, on the East Coast. So I'm sure we'll still be in good shape.
I love it. I love it. Well, I am so excited to be able to chat with y'all today. So let's dig in. Dan, I'm going to shoot the first question over to you. So as a big fan, huge fan of remote work, clearly I'm in a home office, right? I would love to have you tell me your thoughts on what challenges and opportunities you see for HR professionals in managing distributed teams, right? We've got hybrid work, we've got remote, we've got folks going back in the office, we've got folks saying they don't want to go back into the office. Talk to me a little bit about some of those challenges you see as we look forward in 2024.
Yes, firstly, I think one of the biggest trends for definitely last year and heading into this year, especially the first half of this year, is hybrid working and this truce between employers and employees. And we're moving from, the disruption past, when COVID happened and the following, 1 to 2 years, to more experimentation and seeing what's going to work best for different teams, different functions, companies operating in different countries with different regulations. And so we're still a little bit in this experimentation time when companies are like, should we do 5 days, 3 days, 4 days in the office? Should we just, especially smaller companies? And now, there's a whole article this morning written about how Yelp is fully remote. So you still have some companies that are saying, hey, we're going to just maintain what we had, in a post-COVID world. And so I think now, in this, definitely heading into the second half of the year, there's going to be, over half of companies are choosing some sort of hybrid arrangement. And I think it's settled, right? And I think that there's going to be some sort of truce between employer and employee in terms of, where people are working, for how long, and all of those type of, environmental, conditions. And so I think that that's going to happen in the second half of the year. And so, some of the challenges that have gone on and will potentially go on, towards the rest of the year are, being able to maintain communication and collaboration. I think that can be difficult, especially if you don't have teams in the office in the same time and the teams are split. So I think that having kind of a unified strategy and getting a team in person on certain days is probably going to win out in most instances. And I always say in most instances because it's complicated, right? Like everyone's different, teams are different, leaders are different. There's so many different permutations and variables that have to be factored in. I would say another challenge, and this was definitely a big challenge during COVID, and most CEOs, most heads of HR were wrestling with this, is how do you communicate culture or build culture when people are working in different places, right? Because I think one of the big variables is space. So basically when it comes to culture, a lot of this has to do with our senses. And one of the things you lose is touch, right? Touch and feel. And obviously you can kind of see your colleagues and you get a window into their life when you work remote, but maybe it's not the same. And that, again, this is why a lot of executives are saying, well, we do need people in the office because we want to harness teamwork, collaboration, creative ideas, socialization, work relationships that can anchor people into the company. So like that case, but then from the remote case, it's, people want independence, people want the flexibility, especially when it comes to, childcare and different activities that, working parents have, or even non-working parents, in terms of gaining that autonomy. And then I would say opportunities would be for sure, with more flexibility and promoting a more flexible work environment and flexible hours and locations, is access to a bigger talent pool. I mean, that's the reality. Like, as I was mentioning before, with Yelp taking such a hard stance on full-time remote work and, benefiting from productivity, retention, all these, typical HR metrics, they can also recruit people from wherever. Whereas other companies, if an employee is not, or if someone's not living in that location, or is unwilling to move to that location, then they're out of that talent pool for that job. Right. So I think that's a big factor. And then for sure, I mean, cost savings. And this is happening regardless of a company's strategy. The office footprint is declining. So a lot of the conversations now is, okay, we're going to have, a smaller office space, and we have to be more thoughtful about how we're using that space and how we're allocating, labor into that space and managing it, et cetera. So I think that there's some great opportunities to be able to kind of cost save and be more thoughtful about the intent of why people would go to the office versus be at home versus even a third space. And then again, wrapping your heads around these constant challenges and creating policies, procedures, best practices, training managers on how to, because it's not like any of us, unless I don't know, went to school and there was a class, I went to undergraduate business school, say like how to manage a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce. There was no class on this. Right. So it's still very new to people.
Right.
But Dan, I know we're going to get.
No, you go, Jason.
I'm sorry, Rebecca. I can't help myself. I get excited.
You go.
I know we're going to talk about some of this over the course of the time today. Is the world of work is changing. We just have to admit that we are dealing with a very different way, very different tools, whether you're in the office or not. So your return is different. And even the way we're going to be defining team is very different, right? So all of this needs to have a very deep, thoughtful, strategic discussion. And the way we did this yesterday is going to look very different from how we're doing it tomorrow, regardless of where we're doing it, right?
Agree. Yeah, and that was one thing I was looking at too. When in recruiting, it used to be you would look at a resume and call them regardless, right? Normally there would be an address on there, but you would call them, see if they were open to relocation. Now resumes tend to not have an address on them, and the phone numbers don't necessarily give you any hints. I moved from Minnesota 8 years ago to Arizona, and I still have a Minnesota number, so nobody has any idea where I actually am. And then now job postings are more focused on hybrid, remote, or in office, and they're very clear. So your talent pools are changing too, because people are like, wow, if I want to be fully remote, I'm not going to apply to a hybrid job, especially if I know that position is in New York and I'm not there. So your talent pools are different. There's a whole lot of interesting things that are coming out of that. And so as we wrap up this question, Sonia, anything you wanted to add to this one before we move to the next one?
Yeah, just a stat, because, what's a labor economist in this, if not for stats? So I recently came across a study that came out last week. I forgot who it was by exactly, but they were talking about how they surveyed talent managers today, and then they said, what's the hybrid work from office the days that you're currently doing, and then proposed in 5 years, how do you expect that to change? And across industries, it's likely that whatever it is today is going to stay for the next 5 years. The numbers didn't fluctuate very much at all. So I thought that was very interesting. And then when you looked at the top 3 industries for those that are most work from the office, it was actually shockingly lower than I would have thought. So it was averaging less than 2 days and averaging less than 1 day from home. And so hybrid can also mean, 4 days versus 1 day. And I thought the variability there was something to note as well. So yeah, I just thought it's likely to stay to some degree the same. So
interesting.
An interesting point.
I love
there.
that. All right. Well, that was great. Jason, I want to flip this next one over to you. And you had talked about this in that employee experience, talking about AI, and as we reshape the workplace, what are some thoughts that you have on how HR leaders can maintain that balance between using technology to stay efficient, but yet still maintaining that person, that water cooler feeling? What are your thoughts there?
It's a great question. And I think that especially when you're framing this from an HR perspective, there's two sides to this conversation. There's what does this mean for HR as a function? And what does this mean for how HR services the business, right? So for HR, there's the opportunity to use technology for a variety of ways to drive efficiency and automation and add AI for all kinds of wonderful outcomes. And we truly are transforming the function. But I've always been a huge champion and super excited around how, as AI removes some of the administration and removes some of the transactions off of your plate, it gives you opportunities to go high tech, but that also gives you more time to go high touch, right? So what does that free you up to then do more of that is higher value add to really amplify the human element of making an impact as an HR function? Right? So as an HR function, what are you now able to spend more time on that has the biggest impact, right? For your work, for how you spend your time, for the people that you are servicing. Now, as it relates to the business, there's also what are these tools able to deliver that tell you more about your talent? Right? So from an AI perspective, especially talent intelligence here working for Eightfold, what are these tools actually telling you more about your people in real time to be able to understand them, personalize messages and programming, get more granular to understand the nuance and context of individual personas or career paths or one department versus another or one location versus another. And then you can really start to understand the talent versus maybe just the job description and the job title, looking at it from a 30,000-foot view. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here, both as a function and as an organization, for that kind of high tech, high touch. And I think, there really is an opportunity for AI to drive efficiency, but also to kind of amplify the humanity. Right?
Yeah. And it sounds like from what you're saying, the goal is really to drive work satisfaction, right? Take the work off of the plate that maybe isn't as value added or isn't as exciting to allow people to do the things that they do well, as opposed to feeling like they're being maybe stuck in the minutia or doing things that maybe don't bring them joy.
Yeah, and
or is that what you're saying?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add on to it. I just think about using AI on a daily basis, right? Like I always think, how do we make this tangible for people? Like for me, I'm using it every single day. And sometimes I don't even think I'm using it, right? I'm just constantly like building it into what I already do. And I think that that's how employees, leaders are going to be using it is you're already doing this, start to use it to kind of enhance, augment, replace what you're already doing, because then that builds the case for using it. For instance, if I'm, writing a post potentially, I might use AI to quickly give me a train of thought of what's a good headline to use, or what are 10 good headlines to use. Then I can pick the one and then maybe reframe it in a way that I think it works for that audience. So that's something that I would not do before using AI that I'm now doing. Or another thing that people love that we do that's built into what we already do. So like, let's say you have like a Zoom call, or even I guess Microsoft Teams definitely has this Copilot where after the meeting, you get a summary of that meeting. So of course you can record the meeting and have a video, but who wouldn't want a summary of the meeting where you can say, hey, this is the outcome for the first, in terms of this, like even this webinar, the first 10 minutes where we talked about this subject. Now you have a summary of that, you have a summary of the next 10 minutes, et cetera. And it's easy to digest. And then you could actually turn that into content for marketing, for just posting, whatever you want to do. So
Right.
I like that idea, is like, how do we leverage what we're already doing to build and kind of grow or achieve other objectives or make life easier. So there's a lot of different use case, what you could do on a daily basis.
That's
One of my
awesome.
favorite things is that video that shows, you probably have seen it, how software ate hardware, and it's all the things that used to be on your desk that now are an app on your phone, right? And now what we're seeing is how AI is eating software, right? So think about how much time you are now saving from not having to do all of those transactions and do all that administration. So the first part is, what does that free you up to now do? And the second part is, what does the AI now inform and provide insights to now allow
Right.
you to bring forward? So it's that whole, value add, high touch, and amplification, which I think, has multiplication effect, right?
Well, then the other piece of that too, and then Sonia, I have a question for you around this, is the more that is automated or done through AI, the more data we have on things, right? The more that we actually have information on those tasks or on those particular items. So Sonia, with your amazing background with data analytics, all of that, let's talk a little bit about what that looks like then for anticipating future requirements. Like, we already know that right now a lot of jobs are changing, morphing, right? A lot of like data entry, those kind of jobs are going away. Those aren't as important as some future things that are coming. So Sonia, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on how HR teams can use data and analytics to anticipate what's coming in the future. What do they need to be looking forward to? You talked about that 5-year lookout. What do they need to be paying attention to make sure we're hiring the right people today, not just for the skills that they have, but for the skills and the work that's coming?
Right. So, the way that I kind of think about it is, for the last decade, or really 2 decades since the internet and since we've been online, is really that we've been collecting data. We've been collecting all of these sums of data of how things are done. In general, we just all, as organizations, have this mass trove of data. And then with AI, we can actually use it. Of course, we could have used it before with Excel and SQL, and you needed coders to like pinpoint what exactly to look at. But with AI now, you can just plug in. It has a really great user interface. You can make real-time decisions, and I think that's what is really the difference here. You can analyze the data. HR can analyze any type of data, provide those insights, make real-time recommendations, and it's done at such a large scale, it would have really been impossible for humans to do it before at this scale. And with this computational power that we have, and the power of generative AI and the UI that makes it usable, really it's the key of making this data work better for us. And whether that's, like you said, redistributing the tasks between human and tech, which will require the new skills of the future. So I think in a way, HR can also use this data to predict turnover, employee engagement, right? Like, how do the return to office and engagement, and maybe different things like the miles that people are commuting and the number of days in the office, all kind of work together to find out if it's affecting performance or engagement, or whether you can predict turnover this way. And so the human brain can't really calculate that many factors usually. Of course, there, as an economist, there was regressions that we could do with multiple different independent variables for that dependent variable. But even now, you can do that with AI. And of course, there's going to be challenges with integrating it and using it and upskilling people with the right skills to use that. But I think it's a long-term progression, and it's like a linear, it's no longer a linear one-time digital transformation. It's like an ongoing continuous upskilling and reskilling of people, and And really, the way I look at it, and I've heard this elsewhere, it's not mine, but really, it's AI didn't take your job. It's AI took your job to the next level. And I think that's what we really can focus on here.
If you think about it, just adding on to what Sonia said, when COVID happened, HR became like the most important business function, right? Because there was a huge shift. People weren't prepared, to have everyone working from home, to have the right technology, to have people have, home offices to be able to do what they would normally do in the corporate office that already had the technology and the setup and the furniture and all this stuff. So it was a huge shift. HR rose to the occasion. So think of that as like a great example of HR taking this leap and becoming way more valuable to the organization and directly to the CEO. And then think about this next wave, which I think Sonia is describing here, is now HR has all this data that they can leverage at their fingertips to then to remind people that they're that important again, right? Because they'll be able to make these big shifts as companies are disrupted, as they enter new markets, as who knows what could happen in the future, right? Now they can prepare using this data and again, reemphasize how important they are so people don't forget what they did during COVID.
Yeah, and that's great, great points on both sides. And I think, Sonia, what you're talking about too is you're not just talking about what do we need to think about to upskill folks. You're talking about layers of data, right? You're talking about how do we help understand behaviors and predict best practices? How do we think about retention? All of that before you even get to let's talk about what kind of skills somebody needs to be successful. So there's multiple stories that we can tell, and turning data into just numbers into actually information that tells a story that helps drive the business. I love that. So Dan,
Exactly.
I want to flip back to you, Dan, because you mentioned something in your last comment that I think is so important. We talk about that huge disruption that happened with the pandemic, and I think we were able to shift, but it was painful. There were a lot of companies who were not prepared. I was working for a restaurant company. We suddenly had 70,000 people who weren't able to go into the restaurant, and we weren't prepared to connect with them. And when I set up a text campaign to text them all, they responded back like, nope, this organization doesn't text. This is scam. I'm like, no, we're texting now. But it was from one day to the next, they were like, what is this? So it took a long time for folks sometimes to get ready for that, to lean into that transition. So let's talk about going forward about continuous learning, right? And about preparing leaders, but also preparing employees for what that next shift could look like. So in terms of continuous learning, engagement, and development, what does that look like? And how should companies be thinking about that to prepare for that unexpected and to be ready for that next shift, maybe in a little less painful way?
Yeah, and that's not to say who knows what the future holds, and there could be certain disruptions. It could be something that has to do with climate change. It could be another pandemic. We don't know. And so, yes, we can prepare, but at the same time, there will be challenges that that might be almost impossible to prepare from. But what's in our control is, especially from a skills standpoint, is definitely enriching your organization with the right knowledge, the right training programs, access, because I think the biggest skill right now is adaptability. And what's fascinating about this is, back in the day, in I think it was like 2014, I did studies on, what are managers looking for when promoting, what are recruiters looking for when recruiting, like these type of questions back then. And adaptability was at the bottom. Now adaptability has gone right at the top, because as it was kind of hinted at too during this conversation, it's about creating kind of a fluid workforce that is highly adaptable to change. So even though it might be impossible to prepare for the next thing that we don't quite know yet, that could surprise us. No one could prepare for COVID as that example. It's about making the organization more fluid and adaptable with the right skills to meet that need, right? So becoming more, adaptable to change, having an organization that supports employee health and well-being, like these things, will continue to be more important, because as there's disruptions, the organization will feel more protected, safe, secure and a lot of organizations and their employees didn't as much going into COVID. So that's where there was a lot more, struggles and pain. And I think we can prevent some of that pain when we go through the next thing by upskilling, reskilling, ensuring we're using data to have people in the right positions, making the best decisions, and through technology. I think technology, there's no doubt that technology was the underpinning of the challenge, right? Like if this was, 40 years ago and, we didn't have the technology that we do now, you wouldn't be able to work from home. So unemployment would have been a ton more, right? Like 50%, right? I think it's about 50% are people who don't have to be in a physical location or something like that, or 50% of the people who are kind of more of the essential workers. So yeah, I think that the technology component is really important. And then it's being able to use technology across the employee life cycle. So kind of what Sonia was saying, it's like, using predictive analytics to make sure you have the right people in the right positions, workforce planning, making sure, you're able to find the best talent and most expansive talent for given roles that might not even exist yet, but also having an organization that develops employees and promotes via the skills that they have so that they're able to take on these new challenges. So it's really across the whole employee life cycle is how you need to look at things right now.
Yeah, I love that. And that actually leads into a question that I want to flip to Jason about organizational goals and thinking about how companies are setting up their expectations, goals, KPIs, metrics, all of that for going forward. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on strategies that HR teams should be implementing to make sure they've got the right people in the right places as organizational goals are set and maybe look very different going forward than they did in the past.
Sure. So, and I think this piggybacks very well on the last question because, business agility is talent agility, and talent agility conversations often lead to a conversation around skills, because skills have the granularity to allow you to understand the work at hand and the capability of your talent to be able to align to that work very quickly. And when you're talking about agility, it's not just speed, it's the ability to change direction quickly, right?
Love that.
And if you don't know exactly where you're going, but you need to read and react very quickly, that's the ability to make a pivot and to read and to read and move and change and shift. So, in a world in which we live, there's no such thing as a plan, right? You have to have potentially multiple plans and multiple scenarios. So the better you know your talent, the better you can then align your talent to which scenario and which plan actually comes to fruition. So that's the first part. I think the other part was, and it was something Dan just mentioned, where you're planning for roles that you may not even know what they are yet or what they exist yet. And Sonia was recently highlighted in Inc. magazine where she was talking about the benefit of AI from a skills intelligence perspective. And part of it is that what roles will AI create? And a lot of these roles will come from an understanding of skills cross-functionally in unlocking these new roles of the future, what a lot of these job titles that we've never seen before, which if you're paying attention are increasingly hybrid, right? They bridge operations and finance and IT, or they bridge HR and finance and customer success, or there are all these different things that are a mixture of skill sets that may not be easy to source if you're looking straight down in a vertical career ladder, right? If you're looking straight down from a traditional org chart for who do I know on my singular team, right? Because if you think about how career ladders were built and competencies are typically constructed, they're typically built within function, right? And there's not a lot of looking over the walls. And that's why unlocking internal mobility is often so hard, because people don't understand how do I fit to that world over there, or people may call something different over there, or you may have someone doing very similar work with a very different job title and a very different job description. But when you use some advanced technology like talent intelligence and AI, and you look at it at a skills level based on the work that's being done in real time in context, you can actually get at the granularity of this to have this ability to see well, okay, what is actually being done? And how does that compare to what we're seeing in the industry and in the market? And then how does that align to some vision of a strategy that the business is planning for the future? Now let's use all of this data in real time to align to our talent, to say, how can we prepare to develop people and potentially reskill people and redeploy people so that way people are ready to be in position at the time when the moment strikes. So when you're saying, how do we make sure we have the right talent in the right place to support these goals? Part of it is, I mentioned that I was an industry analyst in the past. We used to do a lot of C-suite surveys. Always one of the responses of what are some of the biggest challenges of C-suite leaders? This was always a top 5 response. It was the amount of time it took them to know their existing talent and be able to act on it, right? It was a cumbersome exercise, and in the time it took to gather that information and make a decision on it, sometimes they couldn't react fast enough, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, we're only talking 4 or 5 years ago. I kind of, if you were following my little video box here, I hung my head and chuckled when Dan referred to 2014 as back in the day. That's not back in the day for me, but just to say, like, the world is moving very, very fast, and we are now at a time where we have technology and capability where we're able to look at things in real time with very powerful AI computational data capability, where we're now moving to predictive capability. So when you add that to scenario planning and a better understanding of talent, you now truly are building an HR function that is becoming more talent advisors than HR order takers, right? So
right.
I always talk about being in talent acquisition. We've talked about how several of us grew up in talent acquisition. It was oftentimes where we needed to wait until a requisition was created to get started. Right? Someone would come to me and say, Jason, I just got approval for 200 headcount. What are you going to do to help me? And I would say, well, how many of them did you put in the system? And they would say, well, we sat down and put 45 recs in the system. And I would say, okay, well, I can get started with those 45 because everything needed to start with a rec. Right. Yep. Well, now we're getting to a world where you can start to do a lot of work in advance of that based off of more of a talent-centered approach and a skills-based understanding to position people and prepare people, where instead of starting with a rec, you kind of end a process with a rec. The rec becomes the last mile. Right?
So I absolutely, and I think the way that we're moving is absolutely the right way to move. However, let's just be real. How many of the organizations that we know are able to transition to really focus on skills? Like, it's the right way to think about things, but man, it's really hard. And I think that, candidates aren't applying using a skills-based resume. They're still applying with the standard resume. I think companies say that that's where they want to go. They're not ready. I think that there's a lot of change that needs to happen inside the organization. And so, Sonia, I'll throw this out to you first, but then I want to open it up to the group because I think there's opinions that will come from all of you. How do we actually do that? Like, how do we get companies ready to say, we have to focus on skills, because if we don't, we're going to end up with the same people in the same boxes and unable to move and unable to think differently. How do we do that? How do we how do we push, encourage, and drive that conversation to say, we have information, we have data, and now we actually have to do it? Because the pandemic started that shift, but as soon as things felt like they were going back to normal, I can't tell you how many companies I see just slid right back into their old patterns. So tell me what you think there, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group.
So a couple thoughts. I think it's been difficult for HR leaders so far. They've had a lot of changes coming at them right away. And then the skills-based thing is another thing that they're tackling. And it's like a mountain to tackle, right? And they're just exhausted and they don't really know how to do it because there's no roadmap for it. They've always done full-time employees, and this is a job, and this is an occupation, and this is how we're going to hire. That's how compensation's been tied to that, right? It's not really tied to skills. But I think, as we all know, it's coming. It's the future. And I want to just take an example that I heard recently on a podcast, and the lady on the podcast was talking about how she worked in publishing during the move from print publishing to digital publishing, and she worked in HR, and she was asked by the C-suite, tell me all of the skills that print publishers or print editors will need in the future, and how can we have the ones from the print publishers skills, and how do we upskill them to digital publishing, and who's qualified and who can we keep. And she goes back to them and she's like, okay, well, what skills are the ones that you need for this change? Like, really, like, list out all of the skills that you need. And they couldn't really answer that question because they couldn't really anticipate what are the business goal objectives. And so I really think it's starting with of the mindset of the organization of what's the business objective goals and what are the tasks that are needed to really fill those objectives. And then, skills are made up of tasks are made up with skills. So then you find out what those skills are for those tasks. And so I think we're at this like inflection point really where we don't want to do that again, where we she was telling how they laid off everyone who was in print publishing, and then rehired people with digital publishing skills. And we don't want to do that again. That was a mistake. We have to learn from our mistakes. But we're also at a point where we can pinpoint, using talent intelligence and what Jason just said, we know what the declining skills are and really the declining tasks. And then some of the research that we're doing here at Eightfold is really aligning those with those rising skills and the rising tasks of the future. What's going to be important, what's not going to be as important, and how do you bridge the gap between the two? So whether it's upskilling or it's even reskilling. And an example here is really like customer service representatives, right? We know that a large portion of their work is going to be automated with AI. We've seen studies on this as well. And so if you really break down what are their tasks on a day-to-day and see which ones are being automated, and then what skills do they really have, and then what options do they have for future roles in the company, so that instead of doing layoffs and laying these people off and then hiring more people with those potential skills, but that's going to be hard to find anyway, how do you reskill them into a new position that will be beneficial for your business objective goals as well?
Yeah, I love that. Dan, I'm going to flip over to you to tag onto that, because I think there sometimes has been a bit of a disconnect between what HR knows and what needs to happen and the C-suite and at the top level. So let's talk a little bit about how do you tie those pieces together, right? If the HR leaders are like, we absolutely need to do this. We've got some fabulous people. We know that they have opportunities to move into marketing or move into customer support or whatever, move inside the organization. But how do you get the C-suite on board and connected to those same goals to drive that? Because as you said, Sonia, you can't affect change if it doesn't match with the business goals. And so the business goals and objectives have to be set to be able to feed into them. So Dan, what are your thoughts about that, and how do you tie those things together?
This is why you're seeing a lot of HR executives come from the business, right? Because they're more likely to be able to tie all of this together because they already have the experience, knowledge, connections, et cetera, to be able to pull it off. But in general, just latching onto what everyone said throughout the past, 40 minutes is providing data-driven insights, right? Because at the end of the day, like, you can't just go in there and say, we think we should do X or we should, implement Y. You have to go in there saying, this is what we found based on our talent in terms of what skills they have, what skills they need, where the gap is, potentially the amount of money they need to invest to upskill, training, et cetera. Going in with that type of data, that's how you're going to get the investment dollars and the organizational support. If you go in there, just like anything else, by the way, like if you're looking to get a promotion at work and you go in there and you just say, hey, can I get a promotion? I'd really like that extra title to add to my LinkedIn profile. That's probably not going to work. But if you go in there and saying, I did these projects, with these team members, we got these results that added to, increase productivity, decrease costs, increase revenue, et cetera, you're more likely to be taken seriously because you have a direct impact to the business. So from an HR standpoint, you got to think of it the same way. You need to be equipped using data and all the insights that you have, right, with your department to then be able to walk in with strength. And now you're building a business case using the data to be able to then get the CEO or whomever to make a decision to then support you in your objectives. So I think that is really, really critical across everything. And the good news is this data exists now more than it did years ago, right? Like, an organization, 5-10 years ago would struggle to be able to find where this data is and locate all of it, right? Because it'd be much more spread across the organization and not as accessible. Well, those days are really changing, and you're now seeing, different departments, pull in data where it makes sense. So I think that kind of centralization of data to then have multiple points to then make better decisions is there in a way in which it wasn't in the past. I would also say, I think when it comes to employee experience, which was mentioned earlier, a big reason why that topic has become something that's talked about all the time and is like sort of like a buzzword, and people have full title. There's a ton of people in the HR world who have head of employee experience, director of employee experience, manager of employee experience titles in a way in which it wouldn't be in the past, is because really what their job is not just to be siloed in HR, because in order to build employee experience and foster it and improve it, you have to be connected to communications, you have to be connected to IT. So it's really that type of job, and really how organizations are operating now is like pooling in different departments that in the past would not speak to each other, but now it's mandatory, especially in a hybrid world, right? Like how can IT not be part of that equation, for instance?
Sounds like another one of those cross-functional hybrid roles with a variety of skills.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Jason, anything else you want to add on that before we switch to the next question?
I'm good. Let's go.
Perfect. Okay. So now, Jason, I'm going to come to you with the next question. How's that?
All right.
So as we think about, again, we've talked about data, we've talked about insights, we've talked about AI, we've talked about talent management and ways that we can maybe upskill or reskill folks. When we think about building that culture, that inclusion, that experience, how do you think AI technology is going to continue to positively affect the employee experience? When we think about when folks join companies, we don't know what we don't know, right? We join and we just hope that they've got a strong culture and that there's inclusion and we're going to love everything that we do. And especially being remote, and in the hybrid space, I think that's really interesting as well, because for me, being fully remote, it's a different experience than part of the other part of the leadership team that's in the office and gets to do those water cooler chats. Like, what does that employee experience look like with AI, technology, hybrid workforce, culture? I've just thrown a whole bunch of stuff at you, but I'm just going to stop talking and see what you have to say.
I'm gonna even put a finer point on it and talk about talent intelligence since we're here from an Eightfold perspective. When we're thinking about what it means to be a skills-based organization and why some of that is so difficult, when organizations are trying to become skills-based, there's two sides to the picture. There's mapping skills to jobs, but there's also mapping skills to people in the context of work. And a lot of organizations spend a lot of time mapping skills to jobs because that's how we've always tried to do this.
Right.
But if you think about it, jobs have always been a lagging measure, right? A job description was always how the job has been done. And as soon as you hire the person, they then take that job and bring it somewhere new, right? But now with transformative technology and things like generative AI, that lagging data is moving much faster, and that gap is getting wider and wider. So you need to have technology like AI and talent intelligence to understand what's happening in that job in the moment, with skills mapped to people in the context of work, to get at frequency and recency and where they really are taking that job. So the whole point of this is this becomes a dynamic, updating experience and system in real time that's a win-win for all users, right? So in a system like ours, people are getting matched and personalized to career opportunities as an applicant, as an employee. They're also getting career pathing recommendations for how they could potentially map to the organization. But every time they come into the system, that information is changing and updating as skills add to their profile, as they take training, as they join projects, as they are part of groups, as they work with a mentor. Their information is changing dynamically, but also the organization is changing dynamically, and all of this is continuously updating. So every time they go in there, there's something new to see, there's something new to learn, and there's a potential new place where they can go in the organization. So what does that do? It gives them a new place to potentially explore. It drives adoption. It gives them a new path, which opens up opportunity, increases transparency. It drives interest, right? Gives them a greater opportunity to be retained within the organization. But then on the other side, it gives the organization a better understanding of what that person's interested in. Where are all the places they could potentially go, right? What are all the things that they have the potential to be capable of learning in our organization? Where are all the potential scenarios and use cases in the future where this person can be considered to be in that right place at the right time? So part of this is the dynamic nature of a system like this. It becomes a win-win for all parties to the extent that it is updating in real time with the more information that it gets. But the employee, the applicant, the manager is learning, right? As the organization is learning, and they're learning from each other. And when you're doing this and you're not using lagging data, you're increasingly using real time and sometimes predictive data, right? You have better information to make better decisions for where you want to go next. So all of this increasingly becomes more built around the person, right? And where can I go, and what does this mean to me, and how am I developing skills that are important to me, and how am I contributing in the most meaningful way to my organization? And then as a leader, how am I developing the team members in a way that is important to them, but is maximizing them and amplifying them in the most meaningful way to our business, that is aligning to a strategy, right? That is most meaningful to, where we're trying to go within our industry. So all of this starts to build on itself and perpetuate. But I think this is what happens when you have the large amount of data with the high computational power, with this dynamic system that has personalization and better understanding for all. But this is what it means to have, this kind of a deeper understanding of talent through a deeper lens.
And what I hear you saying then, I think, is that we are going to be shaping how reviews happen, how employees are looked at, right? Instead of having a development plan in your yearly review that's like 6 pages long, here are the things you do well and here are all the things that you don't, right? Looking at more individualized micro development plans based on skills. We have one client that we work with who has said he has employees who have 5 or 6 micro development plans focused around one skill. So it feels more actionable too, right? Like you've got one skill, you can say, hey, I've checked that off and that builds my repository. Then my review doesn't look like here are all of these surprises or things that I learn once a year, but it's that continual updating and engagement that makes a more continuous learning path for both managers and employees. So that
we're
totally
not
makes sense.
removing human discussions and human decisions. We're just giving people more information to have when they're in those settings, right?
That's right. I love that. Okay, so I'm watching the time here. We've got a couple of comments in there. I don't know that we have a ton of questions, but before we do that, I want to wrap it up and give each of you an opportunity to share one piece of advice that you would give to talent leaders as they prepare for the rest of 2024. So Sonia, why don't we go to you first, and then Dan will go to you, and then to Jason.
One piece of advice, I would say it's time to prioritize employee well-being. We touched on this a little bit, but really, I think the companies that do prioritize well-being are able to see their employees empowered and therefore have higher productivity, better customer satisfaction, lower turnover. And really diving into that lower turnover, right? You know that turnover happens in those frontline service industries quite a bit. I think it's like 100% of turnover. And, you know, if you're in that industry and you're in HR, you're like, oh, well, that's what I can't do anything about it. That's just the nature of the industry. You know, call centers, retail, restaurants, whatnot. And the costs are usually 10 to 25% of that overall payroll spent. But to think about really is the indirect costs, which are, you know, the lost sales, the mistakes, the low productivity, the redoing of tasks, and really the inability to differentiate yourself from your competition in the eyes of your customer. So I'll stop there in an effort of time, but I really think that's one thing that HR leaders can think about a little bit more this year.
Love that. All right, Dan, what you got for us?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about, you know, talent analytics and data and leveraging all of that. But I think that really sets up the ability for organizations to be more agile and adaptable. But then I would say for individuals and managers to also be agile and adaptable, because I think that's what's going to be good from the individual standpoint, their careers and their ability to kind of flourish and maintain job security and being relevant. And then from the organization and HR leaders and the C-suite perspective, it's their ability to better kind of manage through the rapidly evolving business landscape, the uncertainty. We have no idea what's going to happen in the future. I mean, you can't not have an agile organization because, you know, you're under threat. You don't know what could happen. It could really be disruptive for you. And you just got to be able to navigate all of these changing priorities. And one of the best ways over the past 3 or so years to be able to do this is through understanding not only where you are, where you want to be, but also from a talent perspective is who you have, you know, how can you get them to travel with you based on where you need to go, right? And the core of that is around skills. You know, taking inventory of, do you have the right skills at the right time to be able to achieve this? If not, you have to be able to acquire those in order to compete. And I think one of the biggest skills, of course, is going to be around AI, and the individuals, managers, HR leaders, C-suite that are able to use it as part of their job are the ones who are going to become more efficient, focus on high impact work, and be successful, as well as have their companies, you know, thrive.
Love it. All right, Jason, bring us home. You got about 37 seconds.
All right, just to sum it up, we are truly at a time of transformation. I mean, the session was appropriately titled Disrupted. For people that are exploring these topics with their organizations or going through these journeys, this is more than just a tool or a technology. This is also a discussion around policy and practice and culture. Put it all on the table. You need to talk about it all together at the same time to truly transform, because we are building a different HR function and a different organization for the future. You can't put together a future operating practice with policies and practices from the 90s or from way back in 2014, back in the day, right?
That's
so
right.
Thank you everyone
That's
for joining us. Over to you, Rebecca.
All right. Well, thanks all. We are out of time. I appreciate all of the conversation. Y'all have been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you next time. Take care, everyone.